Thank you. I already see some questions on the board. Vint, when you're ready, I'm happy to ask you the first one.
Yes, I am ready.
Okay,
So
great.
fire away.
Yeah, nice. It's a technical question. So
Okay.
Stefania is asking, how and if at all would you imagine a different internet architecture now? And what is your advice for mitigating inequalities?
So, boy, that's a lovely question. First of all, I think that we want to build in more security than we have even now. We've added a great deal of security mechanisms into the internet, thanks to public key cryptography, which was developed in the mid 1970s, just about the time that we were freezing the architecture of the internet. But we retrofitted a lot of that. We still need to outfit people with tools in order to make them more secure. So two-factor authentication, for example, physical devices that have cryptographic keys, things like that. When we get to the Internet of Things, for instance, we need strong authentication so that the device knows with whom it should interact. It knows that it should not give data to some entity that it hasn't been authorized, all those sorts of things. So I would add a lot of that. And if I could go back and redo the internet, I would probably try to put some of those things in from the very beginning. There are all kinds of reasons why that might not work, especially given there was mostly graduate students who were doing the work, and they're hard to get graduate students to pay attention to security. They're too busy, with their schoolwork. So anyway, so that's one thing I would do. The inequality part is a real tough problem. The only way we can cope with that is to drive cost out wherever we can, reduce the cost of equipment, reduce the cost of service, find ways of encouraging incentives for building out more internet capacity. So in some cases, that might be a business opportunity. In some cases, in the US, for example, we have something called the Universal Services Fund, which is a tax on telecommunications, and that money used to be intended for universal telephone service. There's no reason why it couldn't be repurposed for universal internet service. So we could see different kinds of incentives for driving commercial interest in building out the internet. We can also see possibilities of repurposing existing capability. I'll give you an example. In the United States, there's something called FirstNet, which is intended to be a big build out to support the fire, police, and emergency medical services organizations throughout the country. And that means towers are going to have to be built, radio access will have to be provided. It may be that those towers could also be used to house radio and optical fiber connectivity in order to increase capacity for rural parts of the country, just as an example. Finally, there is a huge effort underway, particularly at SpaceX, Elon Musk's company, to put low Earth orbiting satellites in place in the tens of thousands. And if this is successful, if it actually works, that might wind up providing internet access everywhere on the surface of the planet. Then we have to worry about cost, for example, and will it be affordable?
And also the cost for the environment, right? So how would something that you described go hand in hand with sustainability? Like, what is even the footprint of the internet? Like, we know that a certain percentage of the carbon emissions is due to internet infrastructure and the usage of internet, but we do not have a lot of reliable data. As you mentioned before, like, data is very important and information there. So how would you join in the kind of green angle into this discussion?
So that's a really good question. And of course, again, we're back to measurement, because if we don't have really good data, how would we be able to project? Let me make an argument, though, that the internet might actually be your friend here. First of all, companies like Google are very committed to green power, which means that the power sources are generated by renewables, for example. And if they're not, there's carbon trading to be done. So that's one thing, and we're working very hard, at least at Google, on that. The second thing is that you might think that direct delivery to someone's home would be expensive from the point of view of emissions into the atmosphere. Of course, electric cars can help with that. I have 2 Teslas, so we're trying to do our bit. But think for just a minute about the efficiency of being able to deliver to a bunch of different homes, instead of having people drive their cars to some store and then do whatever they did and then go back, because they're only serving themselves, one person or one family, whereas the delivery trucks can be quite efficient about their consumption of fuel and emissions and things like that. So and then of course there's the possibility of delivering things digitally rather than delivering them physically. So there's a company called Netflix, which you might be familiar with, and it has shifted dramatically from delivering DVDs in physical form to streaming video. And that again is reduces the emissions. So I think that we're on a path, at least for some of these dimensions, to make a big difference in reducing emissions with regard to pollution.
Next question from the audience, one that got a lot of votes. How can we ensure that next generation internet initiatives, architectures, and protocols value net neutrality, peer-to-peer connectivity, and remain DRM free?
So it's a very, very good question, and one that I resonate strongly with. One interesting thing that your listeners should know, or viewers, I guess, is that the original internet design was intended to be peer-to-peer. If you actually get down into the details of the TCP protocol, which Bob Kahn and I designed way back in 1974, it was intended to allow two devices to simultaneously make a connection to each other. We were thinking IoT-like stuff way back then, although we didn't necessarily have in mind all the various devices that fall into that category. But the idea of these things being able to connect to each other at the same time, peer-to-peer interactions as opposed to client-server interactions, was very much in our minds. So the question now is, how do we achieve the objectives that this question implies? One thing is to highlight the importance of those objectives. The second one is to create incentives that cause those objectives to be attractive. So as an example, regulatory structures can create incentive. An example of this might be that you don't permit vertical integration of the service, then you put in, I would say, boundary points at which all comers have to be treated equally. So the net neutrality that I've always, let's say, advocated for said that the supplier of internet access had to offer the same terms and services to everybody, and that there were no favorites. This didn't mean you couldn't charge more for more capacity, and it did not mean, by the way, that every packet had to be treated exactly the same way. It's just that if you had differential kinds of services, you had to offer them to everybody on the same terms and conditions. And so we just didn't want anti-competitive behavior. We should encourage, for example, multiple providers of service, and we might even argue that there could be intra-modal competition. So Google, for example, put in an optical fiber network in Kampala, Uganda. It offered that fiber network as a wholesale service to retailers. So every retailer got the same deal, got the same charges, and then, well, modulo maybe having higher bandwidth costing more. And then those retailers could then offer that service, resell the service to users, and maybe add some service as well. But the idea here was that a wholesale retail distinction led to a more neutral and more fair potential for new businesses to take advantage of the underlying infrastructure. So that's the kind of thinking that I believe will drive us towards the objectives that this question implies.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We have maybe time for one more question. How can internet become the platform for freedom for people in countries like mine? And I assume this is a country where there's a lot of surveillance online from the government, for example, without the fear of being persecuted for logging online and expressing our minds?
That's really hard. That's a very hard question to answer, because the physical implementation of the internet is such that its physical facilities are inside the boundaries of every country. And so the country can potentially have direct physical control over those resources. And that's how internet gets turned off. From time to time, the internet is shut down because the country says, turn it off. And the physical transport of packets is shut down. So that's a big problem. And of course, if it's an authoritarian regime and it wants to surveil what's going on the network, it may have the ability to do that as well. So one of the things that we advocate for at Google is end-to-end cryptography, so that in the case of our services, from a laptop or mobile or what have you, pad, to our services are fully encrypted. And that crypto is intended to be pretty strong. Also, when the data, that if there is any data that results that's being stored at Google, it's encrypted while it's at rest. So cryptography and access to it can be helpful here. On the other hand, if the country says that it's illegal to encrypt anything, and if we catch you encrypting something, that there will be consequences, that's really hard to undo. There are attempts to offer people ways of getting tunneling, for example, out of the internet wherever they are into the rest of the public internet outside of country. But even that is visible to anyone who's capable of watching the packet traffic. So I wish I could offer a better answer. I mean, when we get the satellite-based capability, you could argue, well, it's hard to control your ability to transmit up and down to the satellite. And that is a correct statement. On the other hand, the fact that you're transmitting may make you visible, and if you're visible, they may discover you're talking to the satellite, and that might be considered illegal in country. So I wish I had better answers than that. Unfortunately, physics is not in our favor here.
So maybe as a last question, because when we talk about technology, we oftentimes have these very dystopian narratives around surveillance, control, disinformation, and you've been opening up about some what visions, what could the future look like? Do you think what are tools, what are techniques, what are some advice for people on how we can think more far into the future and talk about the preferred future for all of us? So maybe as a last kind of comment.
So you've already given some wonderful hints to what the right answer is to that. I mean, one of them is to assure that internet is widely available, that it is affordable, it's reliable, and again, back to incentives, create incentives. So all those things are important to people who can provide that service, and then help people build on top of that, make that platform as useful as possible. And I think we demonstrated over the past 45 years or so that this really is a highly open architecture. So technically, we can keep adding new protocols. We can keep adding new applications. I mean, look at the World Wide Web showed up, almost out of nowhere in early 1990, and it was easy to put it into the internet because the protocol architecture is so open. You can add new protocols at any layer that you want to. You can add new underlying transmission facilities. So when those satellites show up, the internet will simply be, the internet packets will just go on the satellite. So we designed it to be as open as possible to allow people to invent. And so we should, the sky is the limit here. Anything you can program is a possible opportunity on the internet.
Perfect. Thank you for leaving us on this positive note. I'm afraid we have to wrap up, even though there are so many more questions. I hope that we'll see more accessibility and diversity on the internet in the next couple of years. And thank you so much, Cerf. Thank you so much, audience, and have a great afternoon. And
I appreciate that. Thanks so much, Julia. Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.